Mr. Beckler.
Good afternoon, President Reagan.
Good afternoon.
President Reagan, this morning you talked about the meeting that you had with King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. Do you recall discussing with your national security advisor about that time, that was Mr. McFarlane, about a meeting that he had with a representative of Saudi Arabia?
No, I don't recall that.
Do you know whether or not Mr. McFarlane met with Prince Bandar at any time?
Well, I knew Prince Bandar, and he'd been, well, it was an ambassador there for Saudi Arabia, but I don't remember any discussion with him of these things.
Do you recall whether or not you had a discussion with Mr. McFarlane about him speaking with Prince Bandar about Saudi Arabia contributing money to the Contra cause?
It's very possible, but I don't recall it.
President Reagan, this morning we talked about an Asian country. You may recall that exchange that we had, and I'm sorry at that time I didn't have the document handy. I now have something that I'd like to show you, see if it'll refresh your recollection. Let the record reflect, too, the government now has copies of all of our documents, Your Honor.
Good.
There's one for the clerk. What is the court? President Reagan, I'm going to show to you a document that has been marked as Defense Exhibit 5, I believe, for identification. Excuse me, 6. Could you identify what that document is? I refer you to the top of the document right there. I
Yes.
also should point out that, just by way of instruction, that the bracketing, of course, indicates that there was something else there within the brackets, and the phrase Asian country leader has been substituted for what was previously in the brackets. But perhaps you could describe to the members of the jury what this document is.
Well, I would say at first glance that this seems to be the type of briefing that I would get in advance of a meeting with a head of state or a foreign dignitary. And that's what this would be.
So this is a document that you would be given by Mr. McFarlane or perhaps by Admiral Poindexter to help you in a meeting with a head of a foreign state. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what it would seem like, that giving suggestions as to what might be interesting or worthwhile topics of conversation.
Now, referring, if you will, to the third and fourth paragraphs of that document, could you read those and see if that refreshes your recollection as to whether or not you had any conversations with an Asian country leader with regard to providing equipment?
Judge, my only objection is apparently, as I understand, the President doesn't even know whether he's ever seen this before or whether it even came to him. He says it's like the type of thing I would have received. Unless he has some recollection of the document or having saw it, to use it to refresh his recollection about something that he would never have known about in the first place, I don't think is appropriate. That's what my objection goes to.
Well, it seems to me these were talking points made for his use, and so presumably he's seen them at one point or other. Now, whether they still remain in his memory is something else. Again, I'm going to let this question stand.
Mr. President, may I also refer you just to the top of the second page of that document, it will reflect, you cannot mention this, but it will reflect for your eyes and ears who the particular individual was at that country. And ask if that further refreshes your recollection.
No, well, I know this man, of course, very well, and met with him a number of times in his own country. I don't recall, and I don't really know whether such briefings were given to others like the Secretary of State or not, who are going to be meeting with these people. I don't recall seeing this, and as I know that my policy was not to involve others in this. I mean, I wanted them involved, but I didn't want to be on record as doing it.
Well, you testified, of course, earlier today that you did meet with King Fahd, correct?
Yes.
And you testified earlier today that you met with a particular prime minister, is that correct?
Oh, yes.
European country?
Yes, as I say,
my
400 such people.
And my question to you is, do you recall having a meeting in 1985 with this particular Asian country leader?
I object to this regarding the issues in this talking points. I just want to make sure I understand the question.
I'm not sure I understand the objection.
He asked the president if he recalled meeting with this leader, but didn't ask him whether he met with him regarding these matters, because the president had said that he met with him on a number of other matters. Is all I'm asking.
Overruled.
I have to say, I couldn't tell you when. I do know that I had a meeting in the United States at one time, but I also, before in his own country, had a meeting with this particular individual. But I don't recall ever discussing this particular issue with him.
All right, thank you, Mr. President.
As a matter of fact, I have to add that I would question that I discussed this with him, because the size of his particular country and my knowledge of how difficult it would be for them to really come up with any worthwhile help.
Well, I refer you, Mr. President, since you mentioned that, just once again, just to that the fourth paragraph of that memo, excuse me, the fifth paragraph in the front page, which talks specifically about the specific need that perhaps could be fulfilled by a country like that.
Well, it could be. I just plain don't remember.
All right, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, do you recall authorizing others on your staff, in addition to the National Security Advisor, about making contact with third countries?
Yes, I remember that I said that our fellow democracies ought to be as interested in heading off this communization of a country as we are. And I did not suggest that actually soliciting, but that it would be worthwhile to mention to those countries what we were doing, and that we believed it was something that democracy should be interested in.
And who are some of your advisors or your top foreign policy people that you instructed to have such conversations with these various democratic countries?
Well, people associated with the NSC or the CIA or the State Department.
Just for the benefit of the jury, Mr. President, if you could just you know, just tick off a few names of people rather than just generally categorizing the department, if you can remember a few of the names of some of the people.
Well, what bothers me is, then I would be sitting here under oath and guessing.
Well, I don't want you to guess or speculate. I mean, I can show you more examples of the Secretary of State, for example, making contacts with countries, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff chief making and I can go through some of those with you if you'd prefer it that way. I was perhaps thinking maybe we could shortcut it a little bit by you just sort of generally describing some of these efforts by these various leaders.
I just wouldn't attempt to say it because, as I say, the meetings were so frequent and there were so many things discussed that I don't think this is the place for me to say something just on the basis that it sounds logical when I can't actually remember who. I have told you that I have said, and sometimes this was not to an individual, sometimes this would be in a group meeting, that I've said that anyone has an opportunity. I don't think it'd hurt if you mentioned that we're supporting the Contras, and other democracies we think should too.
Do you know whether you, of course, when you say a group, one of those group meetings would have been this NSPG meeting that we discussed this morning?
Could be that, or it could be in the morning briefing that took place, or a cabinet meeting.
In terms of the morning briefing that took place, do you recall talking with Admiral Poindexter about third country support at any of these 0930 morning briefings?
I would have to say I'm sure there must have been such a thing, but again, I cannot recall. It's something that happened every morning in our meetings, and I can...
Number 12.
Marked for identification, Defense Exhibit number 7. Mr. President, I'm going to show you a memorandum which was prepared for you in 1985. It concerns a report on a Central American trip that was made by General Vesey. Could you explain to the members of the jury who General Vesey was?
Oh, dear. I could ask for help there. The name I know is very familiar. I'm wondering if...
This is in connection with a trip by the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Well, that I don't think this was my military aide, but obviously he was in a position to do this. He was the Chief of Staff. And,
Your Honor.
Yes.
We asked whether there were documents that the President ought to examine in connection with his testimony, but this is a 12 or 15-page single-spaced document on various different memoranda. We weren't told any documents that we could have the President examine, and it seems to me, I must say, that it seems a little bit beyond the scope of the itemized questions that we were anticipating, and I only make the statement that I understand that you will want to give the defendant great latitude with this examination, but it was to be specific questions. And this seems to me to be beyond the scope of what you were contemplating by your order, and the President hasn't had a chance to review this quite lengthy document before he's been asked questions about it.
Your Honor, if I may respond to that objection on a couple of grounds. The first is, I understood that the President's counsel was here to object with matters with regard to executive privilege or perhaps SEPA. I think that the objection, since we are simulating trial testimony, is improper for purposes other than that. Point number one. Point number two, is that I wrote a letter to Mr. Olson months ago asking to meet with him, to sit down with his client, to go through testimony, to help him with documents wherever possible, to do whatever has been necessary. And I think to suggest somehow in the presence of the jury that we have not been giving his client documents is an unfair suggestion, Your Honor, and I would respectfully submit that we have been trying to do that, but counsel decided that he did not want to have his client meet with us at any time prior to this testimony. And unfortunately, it's because of that that I have not been able to sit down with him and his client and go over documents.
No, but I take it that Mr. Olson is talking about giving him documents and not sitting down with his client, if I understand his complaint correctly.
Well, Your Honor, if the correspondence started back in September or October between myself and Mr. Olson. The bottom line is, until this court gave the order that President Reagan would have to submit to a videotape testimony, there was no communication between myself and Mr. Olson that was effective, because as this court knows, this witness's position was that he did not want to appear in court. And all of this developed last Friday.
That's all water over the dam.
I understand that, Your Honor.
Let's try to get down to what this is about. Did the government get a copy of this document?
Yes.
Today, I mean, not before.
No.
You told me a minute ago that the government now had copies of all the documents that you were going to use.
At lunchtime today, I gave the government copies of every document we have for this witness today.
Well, I don't know what, I'm not going to try to parcel out now as to who did what and who wrote what letters to somebody else. Let's get back to this document. It is kind of difficult for the president to figure out a document that's fairly long, and you say, well, does this refresh your recollection? I wish you'd get down to something specific.
Your Honor, I have with every one of these documents referred them to a specific paragraph, and I am going to refer them, as I have with others, to a specific paragraph in this document. But I must stress that I believe it's unprecedented to have a third-party witness, counsel, standing up and objecting to questions outside of the parameters that this court has set.
Well, I'm going to allow him to do that because it's also unprecedented to have a former president of the United States testify in this kind of pretrial proceedings. So we're making the procedures fit the particular situation. And one of those is I'm going to allow Mr. Olson, within reason, to complain about things when something is being done to his client that he doesn't like, whether it's justified or not.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Well, this report by General Vesey apparently was to Secretary Weinberg, Secretary of Defense and all. But just from the glance that I've had of the few of this, all I could say is, and the best that I could tell you is that with all of the Central American countries and our contact with them and attempts to find ways to be helpful, Honduras was an exception in the sense of that our relationship there went further and went clear back as far as World War II, when many of our forces that fought in North Africa in World War II shipped out of there. Honduras and the United States have had a military thing in which we have used their country at their permission for the training of some of our forces in jungle warfare. And so it doesn't surprise me at all about communications there with the General Vesey and talking about Honduras. We had frequent contact with them.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just one other thing. They're just referring just to really just one line on this whole document. That is looking at page 2 of the textual part under the paragraph marked Honduras, and you have identified the area that I was going to question you about. It stresses here, does it not, that the most urgent is the Contra support mechanism.
Yes, and it was done in the with recognition that President Suazo's term was running out, coming to an end, and there was going to be a new president and all. And it also refers to something that I think I've spoken about before, and that is that all of the Central American countries, including Honduras, were quite cautious about how far they could go because of the very fact that Nicaragua, under the Sandinistas, had a bigger military than all the other Central American countries put together. And so it would have been improper for us to be pushing them into doing things that might bring down an invasion by Nicaragua of Honduras.
So yours was a delicate task then in trying to coordinate with the Central American countries to keep them on board, so to speak,
Yes,
yet not let them be too threatened by Nicaragua. Is that correct?
that's right, yeah.
Now, Mr. President, do you recall at one point in time in late 1984 or early 1985 sending Bud McFarland down to Central America to have conversations with the Central American countries, leaders of the various Central American countries?
I seem to have a memory that he had a presence there in Central America. I cannot recall the actual conditions and provisions or timing of that visit.
Without knowing the actual timing or the conditions and so on, what were the objectives that Mr. McFarland would have been trying to achieve when he made that trip down to Central America in January of '85?
Well, it very possibly could have been, not with regard to Contras or anything, it could very possibly have been, as I said earlier, that in the beginning of my term, we had an interest in bettering relations between our country and our Latin American neighbors. As a matter of fact, the first trip that I took was at my own choosing when I became president, was to go to South America and Central America and meet in a number of the countries there for the very purpose of having them ask, as each would, because of the conduct of previous presidents, as to, well, okay, what was my proposal? And I took great pleasure in being able to say, I came down here to find out what you think. What, have you got any proposals? What do you think about what we could do, better relations and so forth? And I must say I was quite pleased at the reaction. It would almost be one of blinking eyes and their jaw dropping, because American presidents did not customarily go down there without having some presidential plan of what they should do. And the fact that I had come and asked them what we could do together that might help them and better relations between us as American neighbors, they weren't used to that.
Now, when Mr. McFarland went down there in January of 1985, Mr. President, and he met with these various Central American leaders, do you recall whether or not he briefed you on the results of his trip down there to Central America?
Oh, I'm sure he would have. I can't bring it to mind right now, but of course, anyone who went down there under those circumstances, I think, would bring back a report to me.
Let me show you, if I could, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, I'm going to show you another document, and it's got, it's a 3-page document, but I'm only going to ask you to look at the front page here, specifically that which is labeled discussion down at the bottom of the first page. Just take a look at that paragraph and see if that refreshes your recollection with regard to the conversations you may have had with Mr. McFarland after he came back from Central America. And when you look at that paragraph, I'm just going to ask you to turn, oh, you've already done that, just look, and there's also, I should point out for purposes of the security people here, so they won't get on my back, that there's a bracketed material on page 2, so don't talk about that. And perhaps jump, if you can, to that full paragraph on page 2.
Well, I think this is in keeping with the very things that I've been talking about, of the dilemma of other Central American countries with regard to the strength of Nicaragua and how far they could go with regard to what we thought was the necessary support of the Contras. And yes, this all seems very, very familiar to me, as that of course they were, a number of them were concerned, and some of them had taken some actions because of that concern. And I think this just fits in with what I said about our assuring them that that we recognize their problem and we would be supportive of them in the event of anything untoward happening.
And Mr. Reagan, President Reagan, this document also bears your initials on it, does it not?
Yep.
On page 2?
That's what I did to acknowledge receipt of it.
Looking again at that paragraph on page 2, that full paragraph just before you initialed it, that paragraph discusses the fact that there was a possibility that Honduras was maybe going to back away from the supporting the Contras, but they seem to have reversed their position a little bit. Is that correct?
Well, yes, and probably at some of our meetings and instigation by us. It's, as I said, some of them could get very concerned by the implied threat from the Sandinista government. So, and this was to keep them from doing that. If it seems as if I'm having a little problem with some of these papers, I'd like to remind you that all of the papers having to do with my administration, or me personally, are now filed away for to be later put on display at the Presidential Library when it's finished. There are 50 million pieces of paper.
I can appreciate the fact, Mr. President, that you had a great number of papers, and we've had lots of discussions here with regard to seeing these papers and getting some of them. I can appreciate that, and I certainly don't expect you to, recall all of the paper. I would move this Exhibit 6 for identification into evidence.
I don't object on foundation. I think there may be some relevant issues, but I don't know that we need to argue those right now. I mean, unless he's published it, it can be used here during the deposition. I have some arguments about relevancy as to whether this really is relevant to the issues in this case, but I don't know that I need to take up the court's time on that issue at this point.
Should be moving into evidence as part of an exhibit in the trial of this case before even
Your Honor, I tell you what, to make it easier on everybody, I'll withdraw my motion at this time. I'll renew it after we lay some more foundation. This was one that the President happened to initial but I'll withdraw it for now. We can discuss it when we're back in Washington at the trial.
That'll make it easier.
Just one more question on this document, President Reagan. Just looking at the front page of it again, that paragraph right under discussion.
Which, wait a minute, I got two here.
I'm sorry.
The second one?
Yeah, let me give you a hand there. I'm sorry.
Huh?
Yeah, you have two up there. This one right here.
Ah.
where it says the group agreed that we should make an approach to the Hondurans which emphasizes our commitment to their sovereignty and provides incentives for them to persist in aiding the freedom fighters. Do you have any feel for what is meant by that providing of incentives?
Well,
Just generally tell a jury what
well, yes, I think that I've spoken generally to that already. The fact that we tried to assure them that we wouldn't let disaster fall on them by reason of their supporting the Contras.
Mr. President, do you recall having a meeting with President Suazo of Honduras?
If my memory is correct, yes. I can't bring it to mind or where exactly it was held, but I do believe that either before or just after he left office that I did have a meeting with him. Now, I may be wrong about that, but
No, you're not wrong about that. I'm going to show you some documentation.
all right.
That was not excuse me, I withdraw strike the remarks. And you also wrote a letter to President Suazo, and I'm going to show you a copy of that to refresh your recollection. February 22nd, 5 letter, President Suazo. President Reagan asked that this be marked as Government's Defense Exhibit number 9 for identification. Thank you.
Yes.
Now, that is your signature on that letter, is it not?
That
Mr.
is.
Reagan?
Yep.
And this letter supports the view that you stated before about the continuing
Yes.
efforts to commit yourselves to Honduras and the freedom fighters?
Yes.
That letter also reflects the fact that you had previously sent your National Security Advisor, Bud McFarland, down there to speak to him, does it not?
Yes, I think so.
Now, following that letter to him, do you recall having any telephone conversations or any actual meetings with President Suazo later on in 1985?
I can't say as to any more actual meetings. I do know that there were some phone calls I made to heads of state in Central America.
Let me show you, if I can, Mr. President. Mark is Defense Exhibit number 10 for identification. This is a document which is a recommended telephone call that you made to President Suazo in Honduras on April 25th, 1985. Once again, as you can see, there are some bracketed brackets on the front page of that document. But keeping in mind that there have been some substitutions made, perhaps you can look at that first paragraph, the background, and then state to the jury what the subject matter was of this telephone call. I refer you really to the bottom of that paragraph. Now also, I notice you've turned over the next page. Let me also say that on the bottom of that next page is your own handwritten notes that you took at presumably right after you had the phone call. Now I do have attached to that, I'm not sure if you might have a problem reading your notes.
Yep,
a lot
I sure
of us
would.
do.
Yep.
A lot of us have a problem reading our own notes, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
But I do have written out above that a clearer copy, if you will, of your notes. Perhaps you can just look at that and see if that also refreshes your recollection.
Mr. Beck, have you written something on there that's not on our copy?
Yeah, I tell you I have. What I have on there is last night, Mr. McGovern wrote out, as best as he could, a translation of these notes.
We believe you, Mr. President. I do.
All right. I tell you what, Mr. President, could you just, as best as you can, looking at your notes and the translation up there, read to the jury what your notes were at the time?
I might if I saw my notes actually in my writing as I wrote them, but this copying thing here...
It's a terrible copy.
Yes,
I really have to apologize.
I can't make it out at all. I can if maybe this would shorten things. I could say that this was an incident. I think no, I guess I haven't mentioned it before, but it was one in which a shipment of weapons had been held up by someone in Honduras. Whether it seems in my mind it was a military officer or not who held them up. And I immediately got on the phone to the president about this. And
The president of Honduras.
yes, and the action was that he was able to tell me that they would be released to the Contras.
So in short, he notified the Army commanders who were holding up that shipment of weapons that was going to the Contras and got them to release it.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, in addition to this phone call, as I mentioned a little while ago, you also had a meeting on May 21st of 1985 with President Suazo. I can remind you of that fact, and I do want to show you now some notes reflecting your meeting with President Suazo on that date to refresh your recollection. This will be marked Defense Exhibit 11, identification. Mr. President, I'll show you a copy of this meeting. Let me get these other ones out of the way. So I'm not confused. Once again, this meeting with President Suazo, do you recall where it took place?
Well, I have to recall, I see right here, it took place in the cabinet room, which was usually the meeting place for such things.
And can you tell the members of the jury what the purpose of this meeting was with President Suazo, as best as you can recall?
Well, I think the description down here of it is pretty accurate. It was to provide a public demonstration of the close relationship between our two countries and our commitment to their sovereignty and territorial integrity in the event that the Nicaraguan government should threaten them with any action, and that we were also going to continue our support for the freedom fighters.
Mr. President, during some of these meetings, were you given something like a 3x5 card that you would perhaps refer to from time to time to guide you in your meetings? I mean, you had so many meetings, I'm sure you would be given something.
Yes, it would, and it would simply outline the subjects, the things that I was to see if they didn't bring up that we brought up, that we should talk to together.
Turning over, if you will, in that packet of documents to the fourth page. You notice there, let's see, I'm sorry, not the fourth page, that's my mistake, the sixth page, so two more pages. One more. This is a copy that we received in our discovery request, but it would appear that that was probably a typewritten card, like a 5x7 card. Would that look familiar to you at all?
Well, no. Let me see here.
The one that deals with joint communique?
Yes.
Is that the page?
That's correct, Your Honor,
Okay.
the seventh page, right. It says meeting with President Suazo, joint communique on the top.
Well, this could have been a reminder. Sometimes they were skimpier, and sometimes they did kind of go into
But
depth.
essentially, this was a guide that
Yeah.
you used to help you in these various meetings. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Turning back, if you can, to the third page of that document. I'm sorry, and the page is numbered 3 at the top.
It is number 3.
That's
Yeah.
one of the few that actually has a number on it. So, looking at that first paragraph on that page, and I refer you to the statement where it says, without making the linkage too explicit, it would be useful to remind Suazo that in return for our help in the form of security assurances as well as aid, we do expect cooperation in pursuit of our mutual objectives.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps you could just explain to the jury basically what that refers to.
Well, again, I think it's the same tone that we don't want to press them to go so far that they challenge and the Sandinista government and wind up in open hostilities with them. And that it would be useful, however, to remind them that in return for our help in the form of security assurances as well as aid, that we do expect cooperation, that we feel that there's an obligation on their part to...
So in other words, if some aid and assistance is given to them, you would expect some aid and assistance back from them in combating the spread of the Sandinistas.
Yeah.
Your Honor,
I hope you'll bear with me. The witness is being asked to interpret the words written by another person a number of years ago. He hasn't had a chance to read the document in full, and I cautioned the witness before we appeared here today not to engage in speculation. And if it's not my place to say this, I apologize, and I won't do it anymore. But I'm not sure whether you're
I don't
getting...
mind you saying it, but it seems perfectly good question and good answer. I don't see anything wrong with it. I will rule the objection.
Well, I answered in this case because I've already indicated on other questions that this was a problem in our relationship about the threat to them as per our ability to lessen the threat in their minds in return for joining with us on this particular subject. So that's why I answered here on that. It's in keeping with what our whole attitude was.
Yes, Mr. President. I can say to you, actually, we did call you as our witness, too, so, you know, you don't have to feel compelled to give an explanation on the objections that are being made. I just wanted to let you know that if you felt you had to make some explanation, just to reflect the record, there wasn't a question on the outstanding at that time. Mr. President, did you also meet with President Benjamin Pisa of Costa Rica during 1986, if you recall?
I have to tell you, what?
Just so the record is clear, Benjamin Pisa was not the president of Costa Rica.
Excuse me. Mr. Mixter, I take my hat off to you. What was he?
He was the security minister.
Thank you, sir.
Objection is sustained.
I heard very little argument.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. I'm sorry.
I said, thank you, Your Honor, and I heard very little argument.
Do you recall meeting with Benjamin Pisa of Costa Rica in on or about March of 1986?
I can't say specifically as to who or what. I do know that there were meetings with people representative of the Central American countries, but...
All right, Mr. President, I'm going to show you a document that will just help you with that.
All right. We're
going to get through these leaders fairly quickly. I just, because of the rules, I have to ask you some of these questions before I just show you these documents. And
all right.
All right, let's have this marked as Defense Exhibit 12 for identification. March 17, 86. Mr. President, I showed you a memo that was prepared with regard to your meeting with the Costa Rican Security Minister, Benjamin Pisa.
All right.
And I refer you to the second paragraph, which appears on the second page of that document under background.
Well,
I'm sorry.
well, there it is.
Excuse me. That's it. I've got it turned.
Oh.
This is for everybody else's benefit, but I've turned it to that page for your benefit. Could you take a look at that background paragraph and see if that refreshes your recollection as to the discussions you had with Security Minister Pisa?
Well, it isn't a case of refreshing my memory on this. As I say, I do have a kind of a collective memory that we were in contact with these other states, and therefore I'm safe to say that I think this accurately describes what took place and why.
And what took place was the fact that he had participated in the development of a logistics support base for the United Nicaraguan Opposition. That is one aspect of the Contra freedom fighters. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. And that he had intervened with President Monet. And
all right,
yes,
thank you, Mr. President.
all right.
Excuse me, Mr. President. I had to reposition some of my papers here for a minute.
I understand. With 50 million,
Would you like to?
I was just thinking I maybe take a short break, Your Honor.
All right, let's do that. We'll take a short break, except I'd like counsel to come to the bench
Yes.
for a minute off the videotape part. Take.
Mr. President, from time to time, Admiral Poindexter gave you certain information, did he not, with regard to the Contra freedom fighter situation in Central America?
oh yes, I depended on him for that.
Has to be marked as defense identification 13. Mr. President, this is another one of those documents. It's 3 pages long, but on the second page there's material that is bracketed, and I would ask you to, when you look at this document, particularly when you look at that material, do not in any way refer to the material within those brackets.
I think I should take this opportunity to commend you, Mr. Beckler, for being so careful about all of this. It'll make it much easier to deal with the tape when we're finished.
Thank you, Your Honor. Appreciate that. You may want to, Mr. President, go back to the front page of that document just to get a general overview of the subject of it. That's correct.
Yes, I didn't understand that other.
All right. Mr. President, just going, if you can, to the last page now, that document which we received. When we received these documents in discovery, it was connected to those first 2 pages. And I refer you to matters that were supposed to be told to you by Admiral Poindexter, the first paragraph here.
Judge, I object to that last statement. I don't know of what there is in this document that would indicate that Admiral Poindexter was to tell this witness what's on that document, unless I'd missed something. And I object on the grounds that that statement, I believe, assumes a fact, not an evidence, unless I had misread this document.
I sustain the objection.
Now, let's forget about that last page, Mr. President.
All right. Well, then I won't finish reading it.
Right. We're looking at the first page and the second page of the document, Mr. President. Does it refresh your recollection at all as to Admiral Poindexter reporting to you about certain information that has been gathered with regard to the Nicaraguan-Contra situation?
Well, I depended on him and never had any reason to believe that he wasn't keeping me informed.
And also the fact that it refers, does it not, to the flights by airplanes?
I think there was some of that reconnaissance plane thing there that didn't spark a memory with me.
Just speaking more generally, Mr. President, do you recall ever having any discussions with Admiral Poindexter with regard to intelligence gathering missions that were done by use of airplanes?
Well, I'm sure there were such things. This one doesn't strike a note with me, but then I think that's just my memory, or lack of it.
Mr. President, there came a time, did there not, when, and we talked about this morning just briefly, when Robert McFarlane resigned as your national security advisor. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was in December of 1985, correct?
Yes, but I think he stayed on for a period.
He stayed on a little bit into January of 1986, but...
Yeah. I had talked to him about, he was putting in an 80-hour week, and I talked to him about neglecting his family and so forth for that, and he told me that he was planning to retire because he wanted to be able to spend more time with his family.
And when he stepped down, Admiral Poindexter took over that job in late 1985. Is that correct?
Yeah. I named him to do so.
And why did you name him to replace Bud McFarlane?
I would object to as to why he named Admiral Poindexter.
It isn't on the list, but I'm going to let him ask it anyway.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Well, it was perfectly logical. I was acquainted with him and his work. He had been the deputy of McFarlane, and it seemed the logical thing to do.
Now, one of the first assignments that Admiral Poindexter received from you was to make a trip down to Central America himself. Do you recall discussing that trip with him?
I don't recall the discussion, no. I'm quite sure there must have been one, but I can't recall.
Can you, at this point in time, without recalling the discussion, do you know what the purpose would have been in Admiral Poindexter making a trip down to Central America when he took over the job as National Security Advisor?
Well, I think the same thing that has been going on all along, that now that he was in that position, this was again one of where we had to keep up the confidence of the South American countries that had to be concerned about the possible threat to them from the Sandinista government. And so they needed reassurance almost continually that we wouldn't let them down.
When Admiral Poindexter do you recall getting a report from Admiral Poindexter when he returned from his trip down to Central America as to how he made out down there?
Well, I can't bring to mind a picture of actually getting it, but I would assume that I did get one.
I was going to show you another document, Mr. President, but I've just decided not to, so I thought you'd be happy to hear that.
All right.
Do you recall at all what Admiral Poindexter reported to you, just in a very general sense, when he returned from Central America? This
No.
would have been now in January of '86.
No, I couldn't bring that to mind with all of the meetings that we had and all of the things, the constant information we were getting. So I couldn't specify particularly what that was.
Do you recall any discussions that he may have had with you about the construction of an airstrip down there in Central America?
Well, I did hear, we had learned that there was a rather primitive lane in there in the jungle near the border of Costa Rica, and that was then being put into better shape as a usable airstrip.
Did you have any, do you recall any discussions about who was constructing the airstrip?
Well, no, I assume it was the Costa Rican government.
And do you know what that airstrip was going to be used for?
Well, I know that I hope that it would be used in the delivery when once again we could keep the Contra supplied, that it could be involved in used there if there was need for a refueling or anything of that kind of a plane.
So I take it that generally your recollection of this trip by Admiral Poindexter was that it was a successful trip?
I'm quite sure it was. I think I would have remembered it if it hadn't been.
Do you know who it was that was going to be using the airstrip? It was going to be used for supplying the Contras, but do you know who it was that was actually going to be doing the supplying and using the airstrip?
No, I don't. On that, I don't think I ever considered there would be military planes of ours. So possibly some of those that weren't officially planes of ours that had been helping in the past in deliveries to the Contras and so forth.
Earlier this morning, or earlier today, I should say, you mentioned General Secord, that you knew that he was involved in the Contra supply effort. Was it part of his operation that you thought that might be using the airstrip?
I can't say that I actually recall that, but it seems to me logical that he would have been involved in that.
Bear with me, Mr. President. I'm just going through a few pages of notes here. We might be able to cut it down a little shorter here, all right?
All right.
All right. Some of those were knocked out by the court, too, so you can take credit for it. Just generally then, Mr. President, you mentioned before that you discussed the need to increase U.S. aid to some of these various Central American countries. Did you have those discussions with Admiral Poindexter?
Well, I'm sure we did. Sure we must have. And if I could interject right here, I think it's only fair to myself and to the Admiral to remind ourselves that important as it was and as we felt about the Contra problem, that was only one of many problems and things that we would discuss when we met, having to do with the Cold War, having to do with the situation in the Middle East and Lebanon and so forth. I've just had the feeling here that it sounded as if the only thing we were interested in was this particular situation that was going on. And I've had to sit here and remind myself that no, there was a great big world out there that we were dealing with, and this was just one of the many things that we had to talk about.
Absolutely, Mr. President. And there were, in fact, a whole number of areas of concerns that you and the Admiral had that transcended well beyond any of the events mentioned in this indictment, either the Iran or the Contra situation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Try as I may, I can't quite seem to leave Honduras. Did you also have a meeting that you recall, with President Ascona of Honduras? This was the president who followed President Suazo.
Yes, and I think, I can't swear to an actual physical meeting, although I think there was, but I do know that I was in contact with him, just as I had been with his predecessor.
Do you recall that there was a meeting in the Oval Office with President Ascona?
My memory seems to tell me there was, yes.
Would it refresh your recollection at all to know that there would have been an interpreter present at such a meeting, because President Ascona, I think, did not speak English that well?
Oh, yes, there were, and that wouldn't have stood out because there were so many meetings in which interpreters had to be present. That's where I learned that the English language is much crisper and briefer than any other language in the world. It's because the gentleman talking in his own language could go for a paragraph, and the interpreter could sum it all up in a sentence. And
yeah, you sometimes wonder if you're getting the full story then.
Yes, because the same thing was true when I spoke, and it took him 3 times as long to tell what I had said in his language.
Let me show you, Mr. President, what has been marked as Defense Exhibit 14 for identification. Just looking at that, does this refresh your recollection at all as to whether or not President Ascona had a request to make of you when he met with you? You may wish, I see you've turned the page already, the second page there too, that refers a little bit more to it.
Which page?
Page 2 of that same 3-page document. It's called the Summary of the Honduran Position.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, I'm sorry, just let me know when you finish, Mr. President. Essentially, this document refers, does it not, to a Honduran request for substantial military, $100 million per year in aid for Honduras. Is that correct?
Yes, and this is a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense regarding that.
And do you recall whether or not you had a discussion with with President Ascona on that subject when he met with you?
I'm quite sure from looking at this that he must have, that must have been it, and this is why that this was passed on to the Secretary of Defense, as it was obviously a very substantial increase was being requested here.
Do you recall at this time whether or not there was actually additional aid given to Honduras as a result of these meetings?
No, I can't. I really can't. I'm quite sure we did what we could to help, but I doubt that we could have gone to the length that they were asking.
Probably not 100 million, but maybe more likely 20 million or so?
I won't guess at a figure.
All right. Now, Mr. President, also looking at page 2 of the memo, strike that question. Do you recall whether you discussed this request of President Ascona with anybody else?
Oh, I'm quite sure that we would have discussed it among ourselves.
We being?
Well, I mean,
yourself and Admiral
NSC,
Poindexter?
Defense Department, self, and all of us, with regard to whether there was any possibility that the Congress would go along with some of those requests. They're the only ones that can spend money.
Which turns us, actually, Mr. President, to the next question, which has to do with Congress. In the this meeting with the Honduran President Ascona took place in May of 1986, as you testified a moment ago. Do you recall what posture the administration and your administration was taking with regard to Congress in May of 1986 and Contra funding? What the status was at that time? Maybe you could give the jury just an idea of what the position was at that time, whether the money was coming from Congress, whether you were trying to get money.
You tempt me beyond my strength. It was always a struggle. And I could say almost virtually with anything military, because that seemed to be the only thing which the Congress could decide could be reduced, was military spending. But no, we were having problems because, as I say, they had the majority. There were many congressmen and women who had seen another side of the Sandinistas and were on our side on that. But the majority persisted in not wanting to be of aid.
And I guess you had concerns, did you not, at that time, that Congress was going to delay, if we were going to give any funding to the administration for the Contras or the freedom fighters, it was going to be delayed even more. Did you have concerns about that?
We were always concerned, yes.
Did you and Admiral Poindexter discuss any actions that you should take with regard to Congress on getting this funding that you can think of?
Well, I can't think of anything more than just encouraging them to carry the battle to them.
To carry the battle to, I'm sorry,
to the Congress.
Congress.
About the need and the very definite need for continued help for these other countries down there.
And if you were not able to get any money from Congress in that spring of '86, what were you prepared to do? To somehow do it anyway?
Well, no, to find whatever way we could keep them in existence.
And by that, you're referring now once again to the third countries or private individuals?
Yes. Them and the refugees, their families had to be taken care of while they were out there in the field and all.
We have Exhibit 30. Mr. President, in March of 1986, in fact, March 16th, one day before St. Patrick's Day, you gave a speech to the nation. And one of the topics you covered in that speech was Central America and the problems down there. I'd like to show you a copy of that speech. Have it marked as Defense Exhibit number 15 for identification. This was what I'm showing you is I guess a backup copy that you used, Mr. President, when you make a speech, and referring you, I guess those lines that are drawn on the speech are lines that you put in to break up pauses in your speech?
Yes, I did things like that, and actually usually in doing this, I was doing it from a teleprompter, and I always kept a paper script in case the teleprompter failed us.
All right. Now, going over to page 15 of that speech, I'm not going to ask you to go through the whole speech again. You're just going to move to page 15, and there's only 16 pages in the speech, so we're only going to talk about page 15. Just looking at page 15, the section, the third section on that, where you say, now the Congress must decide where it stands. Perhaps you could look at that paragraph and see if that refreshes your recollection as to your feelings with regard to Congress and its inability to provide aid at that time.
Yes, speeches of this kind were for one reason and one reason only.
And what was that?
The people must be made to communicate with their congressmen and tell them how important this was to them. And that's what the speech was asking them to do, to let their congressmen know that they were on the side of the Contras and that we shouldn't abandon the Contras. This is, here I just turned to 14, I was quoting Claire Booth-Luce on the come vote and so forth. I had a great respect for her.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I'd forgotten all about this speech.
Mr. President, do you know who Oliver North is?
Yes.
Could you please describe to the jury what you know about Oliver North and what his job was when he was working in the White House?
Well, he was mainly performing tasks, as I understand it, for the NSC. But his background and record had been one of being decorated for heroism and so forth in the Vietnamese conflict, and that he had been a very bold and brave soldier, Marine. And so he was, it was my impression, and not from any specific reports or anything, that through all of this, that he was communicating back and forth between and the need for the support of the Contras and so forth.
When you say communicating back and forth between, could you be a little more explicit for the jury, even though you and I might know?
Yeah.
Maybe
Well, I
explain
mean,
to the jury what you're referring to.
between the Contras and their situation and ourselves and the things that we must do for them.
And when you say the things that we must do for them, perhaps you could just spell it out a little bit for the members of the jury.
Well, two kinds of support. One, the provision of... Oh, pardon me.
Your Honor, I object at this point, unless, if we're talking about a specific meeting or conversation or event, but as I understand it, without any foundation whatsoever, Mr. Beckler now is trying to elicit the President's specific understanding of things that Colonel North was doing. And I simply would ask that a foundation be laid, because we're into a relatively important issue in the case. Some foundation be laid of time, date, place, or some meeting, some event, or some source of knowledge so that we can pursue this. There's no foundation laid for the question.
Your Honor, I'll give a little more foundation. In 1980...
All right, let's do that. I don't need much foundation. He's mentioned in the...
I'm not going to give much. It's only going to be a very small foundation.
Okay.
In 1985 and 1986, did you know... Just tell the jury generally what you knew about what Oliver North was doing with regard to helping the situation in Central America vis-a-vis the freedom fighters.
Well, you have to have people that can be available to make contact with the leaders of the Contras and so forth, sometimes closer than just writing a letter. And it was my feeling and my understanding. I did not meet individually with him on any extent at all, but it was my understanding, because his name would crop up in memos and so forth, of that he was doing. And I'm trying to think what the other angle. I know there was another area too in which he participated. Well, for example, in the meeting with the Iranians, he was involved in that, and I think was actually there in the meetings with them. Whether all the time or not, I'm not familiar.
In addition to Colonel North's contacts with the Contras, do you know whether or not he had any contacts or made any presentations or speeches to fundraising, to groups that would raise money for the Contras within the United States, the private citizens?
I don't know. As I say, he would have been one that I cautioned that must obey the law at all times. And I had made it plain that I didn't think we should be out there trying to persuade the people to give money, but we should offer that help to those who were doing that if they needed help in contacting the leadership of the Contras and so forth, that he would be in charge of that.
Give me 34. President Reagan, are you familiar with the term the National Endowment for the Preservation, the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty?
I've seen that, and I've even heard it more lately here, and the only thing I can think is that this must be referring to these steps that we'd taken and organizations and so forth to improve our ability to help the problems of Central America.
And from time to time, President Reagan, did you meet with various private American citizens who you understood had made contributions in one way or another to the Contra cause?
Well, not
I'm not saying you raised any money. I'm just asking you if you met with any private citizens that you can recall.
I know that I met with one, but at the time I wasn't aware of that, and no conversation came up about it. It was a lady who I found out after I had met with her. She'd come here to Washington, and our people thought I ought to meet with her, and we had a brief meeting in the office, and I found out later that she almost single-handedly was providing a helicopter to the Contras.
Do you also recall meeting with a man named Spitz Channel, who was working on this National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty project?
Well, this name is familiar to me, so I suppose that I have to say yes, I remember. I don't remember specific meetings or anything with him, but I know the name is familiar to me.
Let me just have this marked for identification as Defense Exhibit number 16. This is just to refresh your recollection, Mr. President. I believe this is a copy of a photograph of a meeting that you had with Mr. Channel.
Well, pictures don't lie.
It's worth 1,000 words. I wasn't suggesting at all that you were lying either. I just wanted to refresh your recollection. There's some other pictures attached to this as well.
I don't know what group this was in the cabinet room, but this was customary that, and he evidently then was a part of that meeting, and it was customary that we'd take pictures of it.
There's also within that group a picture of Mr. Spitz Channel with Vice President, then Vice President Bush.
Yes, it just came to that. Then I come to some letters.
Just take a quick look at that letter, Mr. President, and see if, I'm not going to ask you any questions about it, just perhaps you could just explain to the jury just in a sentence or two what the point of that letter was.
Well, this first letter that I wrote back to him was, he said, "You and your organization have made a remarkable contribution to the course of democracy in Central America. Keep up the good work." And then there is a second letter.
That's all right, Mr. President. We don't have to go into the next letter.
Yeah. The second letter is a letter of acknowledgement of what his organization is doing. And,
Mr. President, in talking before about Colonel North, you had mentioned that he had the contacts with the Contra leaders down in Central America. I'm just going to show you another photograph here that might, and ask you, this will be marked as Defense Exhibit number 17. Do you by any chance, I know you had a lot of pictures taken in the office, do you recall who was in that picture with Colonel North?
no, that picture's familiar, but I'm darned if I can put a name to it.
Let me show you a picture further down in the stack that is inscribed by you with a name attached to it, and see if that refreshes your recollection.
Well, yes, it does, of course. Adolfo Calero, he was one of the leaders of the Contra group. But I hate to keep throwing figures at you, but I have been told that because of the busyness of our Hollywood photographers. I've got something over 1 million photos. People that came in there as visitors were photographed, and as you can see, more than once here. Yes, Adolfo Carrello. I did not often meet with him. In fact, this may have been the only time that I actually was in his presence.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Planning to recess around 4 o'clock. Like to go through till 4 o'clock, or shall we take a short recess? Mr. Beckler, Mr. Olson, anybody else?
I think it would be a good idea because it's been almost 45 minutes since.
Take a short recess.
Thank you.
All right, very short.
We'll bring you more of this testimony in just a moment.
Go behind the scenes of the events and issues you've been following on C-SPAN. Subscribe to the C-SPAN Update. Designed with the C-SPAN viewer in mind, the update offers you articles about the programs we air, profiles of Washington insiders, and C-SPAN program information. Our redesigned schedule page is easy to read and features highlights of the week you won't want to miss. So call now. Just $24 brings you 50 issues of the C-SPAN Update. Dial 1-800-346-8800. If you call now, C-SPAN will send you a free gift. Gavel to Gavel, the guide to daily business in the House and Senate. Call 1-800-346-8800 and we'll send you both 50 issues of the C-SPAN Update and Gavel to Gavel for just $24. Isn't it time you got an update?
Next, we'll continue the videotaped testimony of former President Ronald Reagan. His remarks were recorded in Los Angeles February 16th and 17th and were played this week in U.S. District Court in Washington. Jurors in the trial of former National Security Advisor John Poindexter saw these videotapes Wednesday. The trial is presided over by Judge Harold Green.
Oh, I'll bet I did that when I pulled this thing off.
I can tell you, Mr. President, we're in the home stretch from my point of view here, if that gives you any comfort. There's not too many more questions left, at least from the defense side at this point.
That sounds good.
I'm sure it does. Mr. President, before the break, we had some questions asked and answered concerning Oliver North and his activities. Do you recall generally that in 1986, when this battle was heating up, if you will, over getting the funding, you were making the speeches and so on, getting the funding from congressmen, that the Congress was starting to press the administration a little bit to try to find out what it was that Oliver North or the administration was doing in Central America?
Everything that I could say mainly about Oliver North were things I heard. We did not meet frequently or anything of that kind, nor do I ever remember having a single meeting with him, as has been hinted at times by others. But no,
What I'm focusing on now, Mr. President, is not so much Oliver North, but rather if you have a recollection as to whether or not the Congress was making inquiries of the White House with regard to what Oliver North was doing. I'm not asking you really at this stage, what you knew about what Oliver North was doing, but rather whether you were aware of the fact that Congress was inquiring about the activities of Oliver North.
I don't recall that, no.
Earlier this morning, Mr. President, you made mention of Tip O'Neill. I think you said that for whatever reason he was opposed to this Contra funding. Do you recall in '86 whether or not any other congressman besides Tip O'Neill had concerns with what the administration was doing in Central America?
Oh, yeah, there was a big division with regard to the quality of the Sandinista government as versus the Contras and so forth. And Tip was very much, as he was a leader of Congress, was a leader in that. And didn't think we should be doing anything at all for them. And he had a big enough following to get a majority vote when it came to shutting off the funds to the freedom fighters. But as I pointed out, he obviously was one who was going along with their disinformation when there was solid evidence to the contrary, that the Sandinistas were, in fact, conducting a totalitarian communist state, and the Contras were, in truth, freedom fighters.
What about Congressman Lee Hamilton? Do you recall whether or not he took any position with regard to this or had any interest in what the administration was doing?
Well, of course, I'm familiar with that name, but I can't pin down now where he was in all of that.
At one point, Lee Hamilton was chairman of the House Intelligence Committee.
Yes.
And
I don't recall what position he was taking or where he was. There's 435 of them, remember?
Now, Mr. President, I realize, of course, that there are all kinds of letters sent to you as the President, and you don't get to see all of them, obviously. That's correct, right?
That is correct.
But I would also gather that there are some letters, incoming letters, and outgoing letters, that even though you might not see them, the subject matter may be of some importance to you. Is that correct?
I have to assume so, yes.
Now, are you familiar with do you recall a system that you had in the White House in which from time to time you would receive a report from your legislative affairs people about, and the general subject matter would be what legislative inquiries were going on or had come into the White House and were going out, and sometimes you would look at those reports and initial those reports?
Yes. Yeah.
Do you recall seeing a report with regard to an incoming, if not the letter itself, an incoming letter from Lee Hamilton, who was chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence? I'd ask that that be marked as Defense Exhibit 18 for identification. This package, Mr. President, contains actually 2 letters. They're identical wording, although they're from 2 different congressmen. One is from Lee Hamilton, that's the one on top, and the second one is from Dante Fascell, who was the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. I would ask you to take a look at the first letter. It's the exact same wording as the second letter, and see if that refreshes your recollection at all as to the House making inquiry with regard to Oliver North.
It's hard for me to believe that I would not receive letters directed personally to me, and yet I have no memory of these. And if I did finally read them, then I'm sure somebody else provided the answer, because I wouldn't have known the answer to this.
Right. Does it strike you as unusual at all that these two letters are identical, yet they come from two different congressmen, but it's the exact same wording?
Well,
Do you get any impression from that fact?
well, because of the leadership's position, firm position on the, with regard to the opposition to the Contra aid and so forth, yes, I could see why maybe some congressmen were given these letters to sign and to mail.
So this was a concerted effort. This wasn't just one congressman sitting down writing a letter. They were probably given multiple copies. Well, strike the question.
I'm just, I have to believe that.
Now, attached to the back of these letters is a resolution of inquiry, which basically, and that resolution of inquiry, of course, is referred to in the letter.
Yes.
And it directs you as the president to provide certain information. Now, when the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee wants to pass a resolution to direct you to provide information to him, what do you think your response normally would be, considering what was going on back there in the summer of 1986, this contest, this struggle, if you will, between the White House and the Congress?
Your Honor, I object, I guess, as to what...
I sustain the objection. I don't understand the question. Maybe the witness does, but I don't.
No.
Let me try to rephrase the question. What position do you recall taking, Mr. President, with regard to a request like this for a resolution of inquiry?
Judge, I object. If he's asking him about this particular resolution, I don't object. But that's not what his question was. He asked him what type of position would you take to a resolution like this. I don't object to him asking about this resolution.
Well, actually, let me address that. I think that if the President of the United States has a view with regard to resolution of inquiries, because they don't happen very often when there's a resolution of inquiry made by the Congress, which is basically demanding the President to give information to Congress, that it's perfectly appropriate for me to ask the President of the United States what position he takes with regard to these resolution of inquiries.
I sustain the objection. I don't know what resolution of inquiries are. Some of them could be about adopting the decimal system, and some of them could be about something controversial. And I suppose the reaction of the President would be depending on what the subject matter is.
All right, well, let me just ask you then.
So I think you ought to get to this resolution.
All right. I'll ask you then, Mr. President, if you generally, without remembering all the specifics, if you had a position with regard to this particular resolution of inquiry.
Well, frankly, I think that I would have to say I just believe that it is a part of the constant effort of the Congress to discredit those who wanted to support the Contras.
And you would have been opposed to this resolution of inquiry, is that correct?
Yes, I would, unless it could be accompanied by some evidence of wrongdoing on the part of the people they were asking about, and this would come back again to that thing about inside or outside the law of the Boland Amendment. But unless there was some evidence of violation there, I think this is just a part of the overall campaign of the Congress.
All right, Mr. President, eventually this, there was an answer written to this letter, to this particular letter from Congressman Hamilton. You didn't write the letter that went out from the White House, but there was a response given to that letter.
There was?
Yes, there was, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. I don't think it's going to come of any great surprise to you, but let me show you the response. There are actually 3 responses, but basically I'll show you the response that was sent to Mr. Hamilton. This is marked 19 for identification. Now, Mr. President, this is a letter that I mentioned earlier that is the subject of a couple of different counts in the indictment. And this is a letter that is signed by Admiral Poindexter and sent to Lee Hamilton. And it's dated July 21st, 1986. Maybe you could take a minute and just read this letter.
I'm in total agreement. If I'd written it myself, I might have used a little profanity.
Thank you. I have no further questions on this particular letter. Just for the record, Mr. President, this is another one of these things I have to go through various procedures. There were similar letters sent to Representative Fussell. I'll put that next to that. And then a complimentary letter was also sent to Representative Les Aspin, all of which contain the same information. I just want you to look at those, and I ask you if your response would be the same with regard to those letters as well. I'm sorry. Those would be marked defense exhibits 20 and 21 for identification. I owe you another set.
Complete support of both letters.
One other question, Mr. President. You have not seen Admiral Poindexter since the day he left the White House back in November of 1986. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You have not seen him in person?
No.
Nor have you talked to him in person. Is that correct?
No. It is correct, yes.
I have no further questions of the witness at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. President, my name is Dan Webb. I am a lawyer with the Office of Independent Counsel in connection with this case, and if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a few questions about some of the matters you testified to here today. Let me start with the last exhibits that Mr. Beckler showed you concerning the letters that John Poindexter sent to Congress on July 21, 1986. Do you still have those in front of you, Mr. President?
Yep.
Okay. I don't have them in front of me, but as long as you do, I think I can ask you a few questions about them.
All right.
Do you see the letter there, I believe, that is addressed to Chairman Fassell of the Armed Services Committee? Or is it the Foreign Affairs Committee?
Yep.
Do you see the middle paragraph that refers to previous information, where John Poindexter is telling the chairman of that congressional committee that there was previous information provided to that committee in 1985?
Well, now, I was looking down here to it forwarded similar letters to Chairman Hamilton and Chairman Aspen, but, oh, wait a minute, up here at the top.
The middle paragraph,
Yes.
Mr. President, says, last fall, in an effort to cooperate
Yeah.
with Chairman Barnes, my predecessor, Robert C. McFarland, met with members of your committee and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. While I did not participate in those discussions, I understand that information on the specific issues raised in House Resolution 485 was provided to your committee, and that this information made it clear that the actions of the National Security Council staff were in compliance with both the spirit and letter of the law regarding support of the Nicaraguan resistance. Do you see that statement?
Yes.
Mr. President, when you just testified in this proceeding that you were in complete agreement with this letter, do you yourself, as you sit here now, do you know what information that John Poindexter is adopting in this letter that was previously given to Congress in 1985?
No, I can't say that I do.
And let me ask you this question based on your role as the chief executive of this nation, sir. If the information that Robert McFarland provided to Congress in 1985 was false, contained lies, and deceived and obstructed Congress, would it still be your belief that John Poindexter should readopt those false statements in responding to Congress on July 21, 1986?
Objection, Your Honor. It calls for a legal conclusion.
Well, I simply, no, I did not have this information, but I have a great deal of confidence in the man who was quoted as sending these letters, McFarland, and I have never caught him or seen him doing anything that was in any way out of line or dishonest, and so I was perfectly willing to accept his defense.
I understand, but I'm just asking you, as I understand it, am I correct, Mr. President, that the letters that you're looking at there from John Poindexter, dated July 21, 1986, you yourself actually did not approve and authorize those letters at the time they were sent. Is that correct?
I have no recollection of doing so.
Okay.
But that could be my memory. I don't remember.
Well, as you sit here now, do you have any recollection of approving for John Poindexter to send these specific letters to Congress?
Well, again, it's a case of memory. I don't recall whether he did or not.
Okay. And my question to you is, would you have approved the sending of these letters to Congress by John Poindexter if you knew that they adopted false information that had been previously supplied to Congress by Mr. McFarland?
No, but I would also, I would have to have it proven to me that they did.
But my question to you is, sir, if you knew that the previous information provided to Congress by Mr. McFarland was false, would you authorize John Poindexter to reaffirm that false information in these letters?
No.
Thank you. Because I take it, Mr. President, you recognize that if in fact, strike the question, I take it as the chief executive and as President of the United States, you did not want, nor did you authorize your top officials of your administration to provide false information to Congress. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
Thank you. I take it also that as President of the United States, you were aware that it not only is wrong, but it is a crime to obstruct Congress and provide them with false information. You were aware of that. Is that correct,
Yes.
sir?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Mr. President, Mr. Beckler has asked you a series of questions here today on direct examination. I guess that maybe I will characterize as illustrating your commitment and your resolve to assist the Contras between the time period of 1984 and 1986. Is that a fair statement that you were committed to helping the Contras within any legal bounds that you could during that time period?
Yes.
Okay. However, as I understand your testimony, at the same time that you were doing that, you attempted to keep your administration's Contra assistance within the confines of the law. At least that was your goal. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you never, and to the best of your knowledge, is it fair to say that you never authorized or approved any member of your administration to assist the Contras in any manner that would be illegal? Is that a fair statement?
Well, that was the thing that I said, that we must, whatever we do, that we must continue helping the Contras, but we must do it within the law.
Okay, and you would never have authorized anyone in your administration to do something that you knowingly believed to be against the law regarding the Contras. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
Okay. Now, and while you were committed to helping the Contras, as I understand your testimony based on certain acts you engaged in and certain opinions that you've rendered to us today, Mr. President, as I understand your testimony, you are also aware today that there were times when people at your National Security Council during that time period, 1984 to 1986, did engage in certain acts to assist the Contras that you were never aware of and that you had not approved. Is that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. There's been no foundation laid for that question.
Let me call your attention to one specific thing I think you testified to on direct. As I understand on direct examination, you related to some extent that your Attorney General, Ed Meese, on or about November 24th, 1986, after making some type of evaluation and inquiry into the Iranian arms sale initiative, advised you that he had discovered that there was some Swiss bank accounts involved and that money out of the Iran arms sales appeared to have gone in some way to assist the Contras. Do you recall that?
What I testified is that that's what was being published and carried on by the press. But to this day, all I know is that a sum of money over and above the $12.2 million purchase price appeared in a Swiss bank account in which it was said that account had been used on other occasions to provide help to the Contras. And to this day, I still, with all of the investigations that have been made, I still have never been given one iota of evidence as to who collected the price, who delivered the final delivery of the weapons, or whether there was ever more money in that Swiss account that had been diverted someplace else. I'm still waiting to find those things out and have never found them out.
At the time that the Iran initiative was ongoing, were you aware that money was being diverted away from the Iranian arms sales and diverted over to aid the Contras? Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't.
And
I was only aware finally that we got our $12 million too.
And when the Attorney General told you about these residual proceeds, was that the first time that you knew about it?
This is when he had found that out, when he set out to see if there was a smoking gun somewhere after that paper in Lebanon had published the false story that we were trading with the Khomeini, and the rest of the media took it up and went with it. And that's when I appointed the Tower Commission to see if they could find out what was the source of the other money. Was any of it diverted? All I knew was the figure that was given me of the money that was in that separate bank account.
My question to you is, sir, had you approved or authorized that diversion while you were President of the United States?
Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning is started on the thesis that somehow there's a crime charged of Mr. Poindexter with regard to diversion of the money. As I understand it, there's nothing in this indictment that charges Admiral Poindexter with any crime having to do with diverting any money. And this extended line of questioning is irrelevant to the matter at hand.
May I simply point out that I had no knowledge then or now that there had been a diversion. And I never used the term, and all I knew was that there was some money that came from someplace in another account, and that the appearance was that it might have been a part of the negotiated sale. And to this day, I don't have any information or knowledge that that wasn't the total amount, that there was a diversion.
Let me repeat my question. My question only to you, sir, is to the extent that there was, in fact, a diversion of proceeds, did you in any way approve or authorize that while you were President of the United States?
For heaven's sakes, no. And when I was once asked about that extra money and said if it was an added sum onto the purchase price, what would I do? I said I would have given it back.
Okay. So the answer to my question is you did not authorize or approve it. Is that correct?
That's right.
Thank you. In fact,
again, I must say, I just want to make it clear, no one has proven to me that there was a diversion.
I understand. I'm just asking you whether you authorized or approved it, and as I understand, your answer is you did not authorize or approve it. Is that correct?
That's right.
Sir, I believe I don't want to belabor this. I'm going to use the term occasionally in my questions. I'll call it the Iran-Contra affair or the Iran-Contra controversy. I think we understand. You at least have those events familiar in your mind as to what that refers to?
Yes.
Okay. At any time, sir, while you were president, did you ever approve or give authority to John Poindexter to obstruct or impede any congressional committee inquiry into events relating to the Iran-Contra controversy?
No,
okay.
I don't.
At any time, did you ever approve or give authority to John Poindexter to make any false or misleading statements to any congressional committee regarding events related to the Iran-Contra controversy?
No, and I don't think any false statements were made.
My question, sir, that's a matter, you do understand that's a matter that ultimately the jury will have an opportunity to determine in this case. Is that?
Objection, Your Honor. When you ask a question, my objection is he asked the question, he got an answer. If he wants to argue something to the jury, he can argue it.
That's well taken. I strike the last comment.
Mr. President, at any time, did John Poindexter ever tell you that he had plans to make or cause others to make any false or misleading statements to any congressional committees regarding events related to the Iran-Contra affair?
There was never any such thing that he ever said to me that
okay.
was false and misleading.
Did John Poindexter ever tell you that he had any plans to in any way obstruct or impede any congressional committee inquiry into events relating to the Iran-Contra affair?
No.
At any time, did John Poindexter ever tell you that he had in fact made any false or misleading statements to any congressional committee regarding events related to the Iran-Contra controversy?
No.
At any time, did John Poindexter ever tell you that he had in fact obstructed or impeded any congressional committee inquiry into events related to the Iran-Contra affair?
Objection, Your Honor. I think that's been asked and answered.
I'm not sure that it's been formulated in different ways, maybe a little different. I'll let it stand.
I'll repeat the question to you,
answer is
Mr. President. At any time, did John Poindexter ever tell you that he had in fact obstructed or impeded any congressional committee inquiry into events relating to the Iran Iran-Contra affair?
No.
At any time, did you ever approve or give authority to John Poindexter to destroy any documents or records that related to the Iran-Contra affair?
No.
At any time, did John Poindexter ever tell you that he planned on destroying any documents or records that related to the Iran-Contra affair?
No.
At any time, did he ever tell you that he actually had destroyed any records or documents related to the Iran-Contra affair?
No.
Did John Poindexter at any time ever tell you that he had learned that Oliver North, in November of 1986, had altered and destroyed records that related to the Iran-Contra affair?
No.
Now, Mr. President, let me direct your attention to the events that relate to the Contras for just a few moments here. If I might, just for a moment, direct your attention back to October of 1984, which is the date I believe Mr. Beckler asked you as far as your recollection of this passage of the Boland Amendment that cut off funding for the Contras. Do you have that date in your mind?
Mm-hmm.
I will assure you, I know it's very difficult for you to remember that, all these dates that the lawyers are dealing with, but if you will accept for a moment that it was in October of 1984 that Congress, that law came into existence that cut off the funding for the Contras at that time. If you could go back with me a bit in time, Mr. President, to that time period. After October of 1984, and going forward up to November of 1986, do you recall at any time ever authorizing or approving the National Security Council accepting the transfer of responsibilities from the Central Intelligence Agency to continue to aid the Contras after the passage of Boland in the same way that the CIA had done before the passage of Boland?
I have no recollection of that.
Okay. And do you recall, if you can, Mr. President, whether, do you remember at any time did John Poindexter or anyone else at the National Security Council ever request from you permission to have the National Security Council in substance replace the Central Intelligence Agency in providing aid to the Contras after Boland shut off the funding coming through the CIA?
I have no recollection of any such thing.
Okay. And as far as, let me see if I can ask you some questions as far as something Mr. Beckler asked you a little bit ago as far as Oliver North is concerned. First of all, when did you first meet Oliver North, if you can remember, Mr. President?
I can't remember. I didn't ever have any extensive contact with him. I heard about him a great deal and reports on him and so forth, but I can't remember when was the first time.
Okay. Now, after the Boland Amendment passed, strike the question, maybe to put this in perspective, I take it you were aware that before the Boland Amendment passed in October of 1984, there was congressional funding through the Central Intelligence Agency that your administration was able to use in a variety of fashions to aid the Contras militarily and paramilitarily. Is that correct?
You say that I wasn't able to use it?
No, that you were. That's probably my mistake.
Oh.
And by the way, Mr. President, if I ask a question that seems confusing or that I haven't expressed myself properly, just tell me and I promise you I'll rephrase it, and because sometimes as lawyers we get going too fast. Let me rephrase that question for you so that you understand what I'm asking. Before the Boland Amendment passed, before the shutoff came, it was, am I correct that there was funding that came through Congress to the Central Intelligence Agency that could be used by the Central Intelligence Agency to aid the Contras militarily and paramilitarily?
Well, now, I have to say again here with regard to memory on these things. I know that there were several times in which money was appropriated and was used, whether it was designated for the CIA or whatever agency, I wouldn't recall now, but I do know that money was appropriated by the Congress for us to use to help the Contras, usually in two amounts. It would be one for just food and sustenance, and the second one would be for ammunition and military weapons and so forth. And that was all, of course, before the Boland Amendment.
And so once the Boland Amendment came into existence, and you actually signed that bill, the Boland Amendment, in October of '84?
Did I sign it, or did I let it become law without my signature? I'm not sure.
I think you signed it, but rather than debate that issue here, you are aware the Boland Amendment became laws. Is that correct,
Yes.
Mr. President?
Yeah.
Once that happened, and the ability of your administration to continue to fund assistance to the Contras for military and paramilitary activities, once that happened, you did not, am I correct, you never authorized the National Security Council, your National Security Council, to continue to aid the Contras militarily and paramilitary in the same way that the CIA had done. Is that correct?
Apparently so. What I did tell him was the thing that I've already testified here to, and that is that the lending of help to people who were raising funds to help them and so forth, things of that kind, but always within the terms of the law.
For example, as far as what the National Security Council was doing after Boland passed, am I correct? It was your understanding that the National Security Council was maintaining a liaison with the freedom fighters until Congress in the future reinstated the necessary funding to assist the Contras militarily. Was that your understanding of what the National Security Council was doing after Boland passed?
Frankly, I can't answer as to whether that was the legal thing. It was, my only understanding was that we were denied the right to spend money to help them militarily, but there wasn't any restriction on whether we could do the things I've talked about of informing others as to how they could help, things of that kind. And that I did approve, and but at the same time recognized we no longer could fund out of government funds their weapons and so forth.
Let me ask the question again then. Did you understand or believe that the National Security Council was in fact, after the passage of Boland, continuing to act as a liaison, to stay in contact with the leaders of the resistance in order to keep contact with them so that there would be contact when funding was reinstated in the future when Congress reinstated it?
Objection, Your Honor. The question has been asked and answered.
Your Honor, I can continue on. I was going to move into a little bit different area, or did you said you want to stop?
I think that's a good idea to recess at this point, and we'll come back at 9:45 tomorrow morning, and we should finish long before lunch. 9:45.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right.